Hello everyone. Every night we walk through the dust of history, every forgotten disaster, and tonight we drift into one that will make you shiver even as you sink into your pillow. Imagine this. You are in Paris, and you don't know that under your feet, the earth is quietly moving, plotting a slow-motion catastrophe that could swallow entire streets. The air is soft, but somewhere deep below, something is beginning to breathe. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you really like what I do here. And let me know where you're listening from in the comments and what time it is. It is late autumn, and Paris has dressed herself in a gown of fog. The gas lamps lining the boulevards glow like floating embers in the mist, their halos smeared by the moisture in the air. You walk along cobblestones slick with drizzle, hearing the muted clatter of carriage wheels and the occasional laughter from cafe terraces. Bread ovens are working overtime, filling the air with that warm, yeasty perfume that could make even the loneliest soul feel at home. But there is a heaviness to the ground tonight, a barely noticeable tremor that makes your boot soles hum. The Seine moves lazily beside you, the moonlight catching on its rippled surface. Barges drift along, their lanterns swaying in rhythm with the current. Somewhere across the river, a violinist plays under an awning, the notes carried away into the fog. It is peaceful, absurdly peaceful, the kind of night that makes you think nothing in the world could possibly go wrong. You pause on a bridge, your hands resting on the cold iron rail, and you do not see the faint pulse of water far downstream, a rhythm out of place. Children dart through narrow alleys, their shouts muffled by the damp air. A group of students gathers around a table outside a smoky cafe, their laughter erupting over mugs of mulled wine. You pass a baker carrying a basket of croissants still warm from the oven. The smell makes you slow your steps. Yet under all this life, the bones of Paris, the soil, the clay, the forgotten lava tunnels, are shifting like something in a restless sleep. Historians are still debating whether this movement began days before or had been building for centuries. The night feels alive in strange ways. Cats dart from shadow to shadow, their tails puffed in the cold. The bells of a distant church mark the hour, their deep tones rolling over the rooftops like lazy waves. Somewhere underground, water is running where water shouldn't be, carving paths through ancient volcanic stone. This city has forgotten it is built above the scars of an old eruption, the kind that doesn't roar anymore, but waits patiently, reshaping the ground grain by grain. And Paris, oblivious, simply continues to breathe. You take a turn into a quieter street, where the fog is thick enough to taste. The lamps here are dimmer, their glass panels streaked with soot. You think you hear a faint rumble. Just a cartwheel, you tell yourself, though you see no cart. Your footfalls echo strangely, as though the earth beneath is hollow. You do not know it yet, but this part of the city will be one of the first to sag when the mud begins its journey. For now you keep walking, your breath making small clouds in the cold air. Up ahead, the marketplace is winding down. Stalls are covered with tarps, merchants muttering to each other as they count their coins. A boy chases after a runaway apple, his laughter carrying into the mist. Somewhere below the cobbles, warm pockets of gas are gathering, pushing upward, making the stones feel just slightly loose underfoot. This is the calm before the city learns how fragile its ground can be. But tonight, no one thinks about the earth. Everyone is thinking about dinner, or music, or the warmth of their beds. By the time you reach your own doorway, the sounds of Paris have folded into the night. The clinking of glasses, the low hum of conversation, the occasional hoofbeat. The fog seems thicker now, swallowing whole streets into gray. You pause for one last glance at the quiet city before going inside, not realizing that in a matter of nights, these same streets will ripple and sink, and the calm you feel now will become a memory retold for generations. The first tremor is so small, you almost convince yourself you imagined it. You are standing in line at a bakery, the warmth of fresh bread curling through the air, when you feel it, a faint ripple under your shoes, like a large animal shifting somewhere deep below. No one else reacts. The baker keeps sliding loaves into paper, coins clink on the counter, and you wonder if perhaps it was just your heartbeat in your ears. But the feeling lingers, the ground slightly breathing. The city has always had its little quirks. Wooden doors that stick in the morning and swing free by night. Uneven cobbles that feel softer after a storm. Old buildings that creak as though whispering secrets to each other. People laugh about it. Paris has moods, they say, and they move on. No one talks about the deep rumble that travels through wine cellars or the sudden stillness in the air just before it comes. Not even when it happens twice in 1 week. A woman selling chestnuts by the bridge swears her cart shook so badly one afternoon that she thought a carriage had hit it. There was no carriage, just a shudder under the planks of the bridge and a few startled pigeons taking off in a cloud of wings. She tells you this as you buy a paper cone of chestnuts, the shells warm in your palm, and you laugh politely. But you feel it again. Faint, quick, gone before you can name it. In the Latin Quarter, a scholar puts his ear to the ground in a narrow alley, startling passers-by. He claims he can hear a rolling under the stones, like barrels being moved through an unseen tunnel. His friends mock him, calling it the wine talking, but he keeps listening. Historians are still debating whether early reports like his were genuine warnings or simply imagination. Either way, nobody listened closely enough to stop what was coming. Night makes it worse. In bed, you sometimes feel the mattress shift just enough to jolt you from the edge of sleep. You sit up, listening. Nothing. Only the slow drip of a gutter outside and the muffled laughter of someone in the street below. But the next day, a crack appears in the plaster above your door. You tell yourself it's from the cold. You keep telling yourself that, even when another appears beside it. Some of the tremors are so gentle they mimic the sway of a boat. You'll be sitting in a cafe, swirling a spoon in your coffee, and suddenly the liquid tilts slightly to one side, just enough to notice. The cup rattles against the saucer, and someone mutters about a draft. But there is no wind here, only that strange, unseen movement under the city's skin. You smile to your companions, but your foot keeps tapping the floor, as if to test its loyalty. By now, a few of the older residents have started talking to each other in hushed voices, the ones who remember stories from their grandparents, about the land to the south, the mountains with their sleeping hearts of fire. They remember that warmth rising from the ground is never just warmth. Still, they stop talking when others pass by. They've lived long enough to know that some warnings are not welcome until it's too late. The tremors do not stop. They become part of the rhythm of life, as unnoticed as the ringing of church bells or the sound of hooves in the street. You adapt. You tell yourself the earth is just settling. But somewhere beneath your boots, molten history is finding its path again, and the city above is nothing more than a lid on a pot that has begun to stir. Far to the south of Paris, in the quiet hills of the Auvergne, lies a volcano so still that locals call it le géant endormi, the sleeping giant. It is a green, gentle dome under a blanket of grass, its slopes dotted with sheep and wildflowers. The air here smells of thyme and damp stone, and the only sounds are cowbells and the sigh of wind through the pines. People picnic on its flanks in summer. Children race to its summit in autumn. No one looks at it and sees danger anymore. It has been more than 6,000 years since its last eruption. The oldest records mention it only in passing, as if it were an unimportant hill. Farmers have built walls from the black, porous rock found nearby, their houses standing firm for generations. School children are taught that it is an extinct volcano, incapable of harm. Even geologists, visiting for the view, sip wine at a rustic inn, without so much as setting up an instrument. If the earth breathes here, it is a slow, lazy sigh. The people of the region love to tell visitors that their volcano is as harmless as an old dog. He barked once long ago, they say, but now he only sleeps. There are even festivals held in its shadow, with market stalls selling cheese, honey, and postcards of its gentle slopes. Lovers walk hand in hand along its ridges, imagining nothing more dramatic than the blush of sunset. The mountain seems like part of the family, ancient, dependable, and entirely without malice. And yet deep inside, there is still warmth. Tiny channels of water run down through porous stone, meeting heat trapped far below. On cold winter mornings, the snow melts faster on its upper slopes than anywhere else. Historians are still debating whether this is simply the Earth's normal respiration or the last vestige of a hidden fire. Most agree it is nothing to fear until fear arrives. Generations ago, there were whispers of strange happenings, a spring that bubbled hotter than usual, the sudden death of fish in a mountain stream, shepherds finding sections of earth unexpectedly soft beneath their boots, like walking over a sponge. But nothing ever came of it, and so the whispers faded into folklore. The volcano remained what it had always been, a quiet backdrop to rural life, a green giant that had forgotten how to roar. From Paris, the Auvergne is spoken of with romantic detachment, a pastoral paradise of wine, cheese, and sleepy landscapes. Even the scientists in the capital consider it a relic of a wilder earth, something to be studied in textbooks, not feared in daily life. When news from the region arrives, it is about harvest yields or the opening of a new spa, never about the ground itself. The city believes the mountain's story is over, but mountains have long memories and their endings are not always as final as they appear. Deep under the placid slopes, pressure shifts and minerals dissolve into the underground waters, making them heavier, thicker, and stranger. The channels that carry these waters are ancient, older than Paris itself, and some of them point directly toward the great river systems that feed the capital. A path is forming, one slow breath at a time. For now the volcano sleeps, and the people of Paris dream in peace. But there will come a night when that ancient hill stirs, not in fire and ash, but in something slower, heavier, and just as unstoppable. When it moves, it will not roar. It will sigh, and its sigh will carry all the way to the heart of the city. The interior of the Auvergne volcano is not solid. It is honeycombed with ancient lava tubes, long tunnels carved when molten rock once surged through its core. Over millennia, some of these tubes collapsed, others filled with water, and a few became secret passageways for air and heat. The locals never see them, never think of them, but deep below they are the veins and arteries of the sleeping giant. And veins, when neglected, sometimes give way. Historians are still debating whether these tunnels have been slowly weakening for centuries or if their decay began only in recent decades. Some argue that erosion from underground springs has been silently widening the passages, making the roof of each tube thinner with every passing year. Others believe the cracks have been there all along, only now beginning to align in ways that matter. What they agree on is simple. Such networks can connect far beyond their birthplace, carrying whatever moves inside them to places no one expects. Old mining records from the region mention warm drafts rising from deep shafts, even in the coldest months. There are accounts of water in certain wells tasting faintly of sulfur, though the source was never found. One 18th century travel journal describes a gentle humming beneath the stones in a meadow near the mountain's base. At the time, such details were curiosities, oddities you told visitors to amuse them over dinner. No one thought to link them to a threat. The tubes, some barely wider than a tunnel for a fox, others large enough to walk through, stretch for miles in every direction. Many end in nothing, a pile of collapsed rock, a pocket of trapped air. But a few, according to rare geological maps, angle toward the great river valleys that cut through the land. If mud or water ever claimed those passages, the journey to Paris would be swift, silent, and unstoppable. Scientists today would recognize the danger instantly, but the 19th century world was slower to suspect such invisible highways beneath the earth. The belief then was that land moved only when pushed by great earthquakes or active volcanoes, not by a long-dead mountain leaking into its own shadowed veins. Paris, far away, felt entirely safe, as though distance alone was a guarantee against geology. Still, there were hints. A farmer once claimed to have heard a gurgling sound from a dry well after heavy rains. A surveyor's map showed subtle shifts in terrain over a decade, but the changes were dismissed as measurement errors. Even when a shepherd's dog vanished into a sudden sinkhole and reappeared hours later, covered in warm mud, the story was passed off as a strange accident. Beneath all of this, the lava tubes remained patient. When the ground above shifted, they flexed. When water trickled in, they carried it. When heat rose from deep below, they sighed it away into the hills. But pressure builds in the dark, and one day a single weakened wall will break. When it does, the quiet sigh will become a breath that reaches the city itself. And so the debate continues. In archives and over wine in quiet university offices, did the tubes fail slowly over centuries? Or did the mountains simply choose one moment to let go? Either way, the result will be the same. Paris will one day hear the breath of a volcano it thought was gone forever. If you've never stood on the side of an old volcano, it's easy to think of it as just a hill with better marketing. But the truth is, even when they look quiet, they are alive in ways you can't see. The ground beneath you is layered like a cake. Only the frosting is soil and grass. And the deeper you go, the more you find twisted rock, pockets of trapped air, and places where heat still lingers. It's not the kind of heat you can feel on your skin. Yet, old volcanoes don't breathe like we do, but they have their own rhythm. Underground, water seeps into cracks, meets ancient warmth, and rises again as steam or gas. That movement pushes and pulls at the ground above, so slowly that you'd never notice unless you knew where to look. Historians are still debating whether the Auvergne volcano's breathing had been steady for centuries or if it had started to grow heavier in the decades before Paris felt it. Either way, the breath was moving north. Think of it like an old house in winter. The air creaks through vents, doors swell or shrink depending on the humidity, and every so often you hear a faint pop in the walls. That's how a volcano behaves when it's sleeping. The structure shifts, relaxes, and adjusts itself, quietly reshaping without the drama of an eruption. Only here, those little adjustments can change the course of rivers, tilt fields just enough to reroute rain, and in rare cases, send things downhill that have no business traveling. Deep below, the air pressure changes with the seasons. In heavy rains, the volcano drinks like a sponge, pulling water into its buried tunnels. In dry summers, that water shrinks back, leaving empty pockets. You can almost imagine the mountain sighing, expanding and contracting over and over. Geologists compare it to a sleeping giant shifting under a blanket. Only this blanket is the crust of the earth, and it's got cities tucked into its folds. People who live on volcanoes notice things city folk don't. In the Auvergne, shepherds talked about how the ground felt warmer in some spots during winter, like stepping onto a hidden stove. Farmers knew which fields grew the earliest crops because the soil never froze as hard there. Tourists might dismiss it as a cute local superstition, but those tiny temperature changes are like a pulse you can measure if you're paying attention. And this volcano's pulse had been quickening. Paris, of course, had no idea. The people there were too far away to feel the warmth or hear the soft groans underground. And when reports did reach the capital, they were tucked into the back pages of rural newspapers, somewhere between the weather forecast and a story about a farmer's record pumpkin. If anyone in Paris read them, they probably shrugged, thinking, it's just the countryside being dramatic. But mountains don't care about human attention. They breathe whether you watch them or not. The Auvergne volcano had been breathing quietly for centuries, sending little sighs into the rivers and streams that ran toward the Seine. Most of those sighs dissolved harmlessly into the water. But one day the breath would carry more than air. It would carry something heavier, darker, and far more determined. For now the giant lay under its green blanket, exhaling into the earth. Unnoticed. Paris would keep sleeping. The shepherds would keep talking to the wind, and the volcano would keep breathing in the dark, slowly aligning every hidden channel beneath the land for a journey no one would believe, until they saw it running down their own streets. Far below the gentle slopes of the Auvergne volcano, winter and summer live side by side. In deep cracks where ice has rested for centuries, slow trickles of warmth from the Earth's core meet frozen walls and start to carve them away. What begins as a thin thread of meltwater grows heavier over time, blending with minerals from the rock. The result isn't clean water. It's a thick, gray soup. And that soup doesn't stay put. It wants to travel. This isn't the mud you find after a rainstorm. It's denser, almost alive in the way it moves. Every drop that melts into it adds weight, and with weight comes pressure. That pressure searches for a way out, through cracks, fissures, and those ancient lava tubes the mountain left behind. Historians are still debating whether these underground mud pockets formed suddenly after a warm winter or if they'd been building for decades, quietly gathering until they had enough mass to start pushing forward. Sometimes the pressure releases in tiny ways. A puff of steam from a crack in the ground. A spring that suddenly runs brown instead of clear. Shepherds in the region used to tell stories of streams that woke up angry overnight, bringing mud instead of water. They'd watch as frogs, driven from their usual spots, hopped across fields to escape the shifting banks. To them, it was nature's odd mood swing. To a geologist, it's a warning. Once this type of mud gets moving, it doesn't behave like a liquid. It oozes, it creeps, and it can slide uphill if the pressure behind it is strong enough. Imagine honey on a tilted plate, slow, stubborn, and unstoppable. Now picture that honey stretching for miles beneath the surface, connecting distant valleys. That's what was forming under the volcano, a hidden web of gray, molten earth ready to unroll itself toward the north. The locals knew the ground was strange in certain places, fields that always stayed damp, even in dry months, barns that needed their doors shaved down every year because the foundation shifted just enough to jam them shut. Sometimes a fence post would tilt overnight, leaning toward some unseen pull. Most people laughed it off. Old land settling, they'd say. But those small shifts were the first ripples of something much larger. In the depth of winter, the melting slows, the mud stiffens, and the pressure takes a breath. But when spring comes early, the meltwater rushes in faster than the tunnels can handle. The pockets swell like balloons, straining against their walls. It's a silent process, no explosions, no smoke, just a deep, slow tightening that no one above can feel. Until one day the ground lets go. Paris couldn't have imagined it. Hundreds of miles away there were no signs, no warnings in the river, no rumble you could hear over the clatter of horse hooves. But underground, the mud was already on the move, inching through the veins of the land, testing its roots. And some of those roots, drawn centuries ago by the cooling of lava, pointed directly toward the Seine. When mud like this decides to travel, it doesn't stop for borders or maps. It follows gravity, pressure, and the invisible skeleton of the earth. The Auvergne volcano was simply the heart pumping it forward, and Paris was one of the low points waiting at the end of its journey. Up in the high meadows of the Auvergne, winter is usually brutal. Snow lies thick enough to muffle footsteps, and the ground freezes hard as stone. But that year, the shepherds began noticing odd patches where the snow melted first. White fields would stretch for miles, then, suddenly, a circle of bare earth, steaming gently in the cold. It was the kind of thing you couldn't unsee once you'd noticed, and once you did, you began finding it everywhere. Shepherds have long memories. They remembered their fathers pointing out those same spots decades earlier, calling them the giant's breath. The old men claimed that standing in those places in midwinter was like standing above an oven. Heat rising through your boots, warming your bones. Some even joked that if you stayed too long, you'd feel the giant waking under your feet. The younger shepherds laughed at the idea, but they still avoided sitting there for lunch. Animals noticed it too. Sheep wandered toward those bare spots instinctively, as if they preferred the warmth. Dogs circled them cautiously, sniffing the air before lying down. Sometimes, after a night of frost, you could see steam curling upward from the ground, like breath in the morning. Historians are still debating whether this was caused purely by geothermal heat or by the shifting of underground mud pockets. Either way, it was a quiet signal from below. One winter afternoon, an old shepherd named Etienne leaned on his crook, staring at a steaming patch near the ridge. He'd seen it grow wider over the past month, the earth around it sinking just slightly, as though someone had stepped on soft clay. He told the others in the village, but they just shrugged. The ground's always been strange up there, they said. It's nothing new. But Etienne couldn't shake the feeling that it was different this time. The warmth wasn't constant, it pulsed. Some days it was faint, just enough to melt a thin ring in the snow. Other days it was so strong that the ground felt spongy underfoot. Shepherds whispered that it matched the timing of the underground tremors. When the earth shivered, the warm spots seemed to breathe. No one could prove it, but the coincidence gnawed at those who paid attention. As winter wore on, the warm patches grew more frequent and closer together. Etienne began marking them on a rough map in his hut. He realized they formed a loose line, leading down toward the river valley. It was as if the heat was tracing a path, not upward to the sky, but sideways through the earth, towards somewhere far beyond their hills. In the village tavern, talk about the warm soil turned into a kind of superstition. People joked about baking bread by burying dough in the ground, but a few, remembering older tales, grew uneasy. There was a legend about a year when the river downstream had run thick with mud for a month, though no rain had fallen. No one knew where it had come from. That story began sounding less like a fairy tale. Still, nothing dramatic happened. No fire, no smoke, no reason to pack up and leave. So the shepherds kept tending their flocks, keeping one wary eye on the ground. They didn't know that these warm spots were the first soft exhale of something much bigger, something that would in time leave Paris gasping. In Paris, winter was for salons and soirees, not for worrying about the mood swings of distant hills. The city's elite gathered in glittering rooms lit by chandeliers, trading gossip over champagne. If a letter arrived from the countryside mentioning warm soil in the snow or a faint trembling of the ground, it was folded away politely, never to interrupt the music. To them, such tales belonged in folk songs, not in serious conversation. When rural messengers did try to bring their warnings, they were met with indulgent smiles. "Ah, the shepherds and their legends," the city officials would say, pouring another glass of wine. A warm patch of ground, steam in winter. Surely it was nothing more than natural springs or some harmless quirk of the land. Paris prided itself on its reason and refinement. Things like superstition were for other people, far away. Even the newspapers played along. Reports from the provinces were tucked in the back pages, beside advertisements for patent medicines and miracle tonics. An article about a glowing field in the Auvergne might sit right below a story on a talking parrot or a farmer's oversized pumpkin. To the urban reader, it was entertainment, not evidence. Historians are still debating whether this attitude came from ignorance, arrogance, or simple distraction. In truth, Paris had other worries. Political debates filled the cafes, the stock exchange buzzed with rumors, and a new opera was opening on the boulevard. Who had time to fret about distant hills breathing under their snow? The volcano was a green dot on a map, a romantic destination for hikers in the summer. Nothing more. One rural scientist did try to sound the alarm. He sent sketches of soil temperature patterns to the Académie des Sciences, showing the strange alignment of warm spots leading toward major rivers. The reply was curt: "Your data is inconclusive. Your theories speculative." It was the 19th century equivalent of being ghosted. He packed his papers away, and Paris forgot his name. The few who believed the stories from the hills found it hard to make their case. Without dramatic events, no flames, no smoke, there was nothing to grip the city's attention. And besides, Paris had seen real disasters: floods, fires, riots. Against those memories, a little warmth in the countryside seemed laughable. Yet ignoring the countryside meant ignoring its whispers. The rivers that fed Paris began to carry faint traces of silt. So fine it went unnoticed unless you scooped the water in your hand. It was the first fingerprint of the mud making its way north. But in the grand salons, no one was holding river water. They were holding crystal glasses. And so, Paris kept dancing under its chandeliers, the city's heartbeat set to the rhythm of waltzes and carriage wheels. Outside the glitter, far away in the sleeping hills, the ground was making plans. It would not be rushed, and it would not ask permission. Spring arrived early that year, as if winter had simply grown tired and left without saying goodbye. In the hills of the Auvergne, snowmelt rushed into the streams, carrying with it bits of loosened soil from the warm patches the shepherds had whispered about. By the time those streams reached the Loire, they were swollen, pushing against their banks like restless animals. In Paris, the Seine began to run higher and faster, lapping at the stone embankments with a sound that felt a little too impatient. Rivers have moods, and that spring, they seemed short-tempered. Bargemen cursed as the current twisted their craft off course, and ferrymen found themselves rowing harder than usual just to cross the same stretch of water. Along the Loire, willows leaned into the flow as if being pulled. Fishermen mumbled about a strange thickness in the water, the way it swirled in lazy circles where it should have been smooth. Historians are still debating whether these early signs were caused by normal meltwater or by something heavier sliding in from the south. In Paris, children leaned over the quays to watch the water slap against the stone, delighted by the spray. Lovers walked along the river paths, dodging puddles left by waves that splashed higher than expected. The city's poets called it the Seine in springtime, eager to see the world. No one spoke about the possibility that the river might be carrying something other than melted snow. After all, Paris had seen many springs, many floods. This was nothing new. Downstream along the Loire, farmers worried about their fields. The water was already creeping into the lower meadows, soaking the roots of early crops. Some claim the mud left behind had a strange smell, faintly sulfurous, though they couldn't agree on whether it came from the earth or from the tools they used to till it. In some places, the river left a thin film on the grass, slippery underfoot, almost greasy to the touch. Back in the capital, the government kept one eye on the water levels but didn't raise alarms. Flooding was part of the natural rhythm, something you managed, not feared. Sandbags were stacked in a few low-lying districts, more as a precaution than a necessity. Parisians were reassured by the familiar rituals, not realizing that this time, the danger wasn't just water height, but what the water was quietly carrying. Somewhere between the hills and the city, invisible to anyone above, the swollen rivers were being fed by side channels, ancient, hidden conduits carved by volcanic heat ages ago. Into these channels, the early spring rains had poured not just water, but the first threads of heavy volcanic mud. The rivers were now couriers, delivering a message no one had asked for. The signs were there for those who paid attention. In a village along the Loire, a ferryman noticed the underside of his boat was stained gray after a crossing. In another, laundry hung by the river came back with stubborn spots that soap couldn't lift. They were little things, easy to laugh off or ignore, and that's exactly what people did. Paris was still laughing too, at plays and salons, on cafe terraces. The water in the Seine shimmered in the sunlight, a picture of springtime charm. But below that shimmer, the current had begun to change, carrying a new weight from a place no one in the city was thinking about. The sleeping giant far to the south, already sending its breath through the veins of France. At first, it was just a faint note on the wind, something you might notice for a second before it slipped away. A whiff of rotten eggs, too light to be offensive but too strange to ignore. Along the Loire, the fishermen smelled it first. They stood on the banks, sniffing the air like dogs catching a scent. Some swore it was sulfur, others blamed dead fish caught in the reeds. But no one could point to the exact source. The smell seemed to come from the water itself. On warmer afternoons, it grew stronger. The scent clung to the wooden hulls of boats, to the ropes used for tying them, even to the hands of the men pulling nets from the current. It wasn't enough to make anyone ill, but it was enough to stir memory of hot springs in the mountains, of volcanic baths far from here. Historians are still debating whether the sulfur came from ancient mineral deposits or from freshly disturbed volcanic soil sliding slowly into the rivers. In some villages, people began boiling their drinking water, just in case. It left a faint taste, metallic and bitter, as though the river had been steeped with old coins. Horses balked at stepping into the shallows, and cattle drank less from the troughs. The elders muttered that animals could smell trouble before humans ever would. Most dismissed it as country superstition, yet quietly began drawing their water from wells instead. The odor was faintest in Paris, almost masked by the everyday smells of the city. Baking bread, coal smoke, horse manure, the tang of wine from spilled barrels. But here and there, along the quieter stretches of the Seine, someone leaning over the embankment might wrinkle their nose and wonder what the river was hiding. No one thought to connect it to the rains or to the strange warmth in the Auvergne hills. Downstream, the smell clung stubbornly to anything the water touched. Fishermen pulling in their catch found the fish's skin slicker than usual, their scales coated in a thin layer of silt. Washing them took longer, and some swore the flesh cooked differently, softer, as if it had been pre-soaked in something the river wouldn't name. Customers in the market noticed, but shrugged. Fish was fish, and supper was supper. One evening in a riverside village, the scent grew so sharp that a woman closed her shutters against it, convinced a storm was coming. In the morning, the air was clear again, but the riverbank was lined with a ribbon of gray mud, soft as clay and smelling faintly of burnt matches. Children poked at it with sticks until their mothers dragged them away. It dried into a cracked crust that crumbled at the touch. The truth was simple. The mud had begun its journey in the volcano's deep tunnels, soaking up minerals and gases as it moved. By the time it joined the river, it carried the mountain's signature in its very scent. The rivers were now messengers, and they were not whispering. They were breathing out slowly into every town they passed. Paris still didn't notice. The cafes were full, the theaters glittered, and the Seine ran on, hiding its new perfume under ripples of spring sunlight. but the smell was a promise. And like all promises carried by the earth, it would be kept. The first dead eel washed up on the riverbank at dawn, its silver body twisting faintly in the current before lodging against a rock. A fisherman spotted it while checking his lines. By the end of the week, there were more. Eels, trout, even the occasional carp drifting belly up. Not enough to cause panic, but enough to make the fishermen mutter to each other over their nets. Eels, they said, didn't die without a fight, and they never came to the surface unless something was wrong below. Along certain bends of the Loire, the water behaved strangely. Patches of it seemed to boil, though the air was cool and still. Tiny bubbles rose in steady streams from the riverbed, breaking the surface with a hiss. It was not the chaotic splash of fish, but something more deliberate, as if the river itself was breathing through its skin. Historians are still debating whether these eddies were caused by gas venting from underground mud flows or by trapped air escaping from shifting channels. Fishermen avoided setting their nets near those spots. They claimed the water felt warmer there, almost silky against the skin. The fish caught nearby tasted different, their flesh softer, their smell sharper, as if they'd been soaking in the same faint sulfur that clung to the mud. Some refused to sell these catches in the market, fearing they'd ruin their reputation. Others sold them quietly to buyers who didn't ask questions. In smaller villages, children dared each other to stick their feet into the boiling patches, squealing when the warm water wrapped around their ankles. Parents scolded them, warning of river spirits or sickness. But at night, even the adults gathered to watch the eddies, the glow of lanterns dancing over the strange, restless water. They didn't know it yet, but these spots marked the hidden mouths of the volcano's ancient tunnels, now breathing into the rivers. By the time the signs reached the Seine, they had been softened by distance. In Paris, you might only notice a few more dead fish than usual at the market, or a ripple on a windless afternoon. But the fishermen on the city's outskirts saw more. They watched the bubbles rise near their boats and felt the current tug at odd angles. It was as if the river had a pulse of its own, one that didn't match the rhythm of the tides. One old fisherman, Jacques, swore he'd seen something even stranger, a swirl of thick, gray water moving upstream against the current before dissolving into the flow. No one believed him, though he told the story often enough to become known as Jacques the Upstream Man. He didn't care. He said it was better to be laughed at than to be surprised. The riverside taverns filled with quiet speculation. Was it a new kind of pollution, a shift in the riverbed, or something deeper? A few remembered hearing about the warm hills in the Auvergne, but it seemed too far, too disconnected to matter here. Besides, Paris was still dry, the streets still busy, and the world above the water still ordinary. For now, the eels would keep coming, the eddies would keep boiling, and the fishermen would keep watching the water with narrowed eyes. Somewhere deep below, the mud was stretching its fingers farther north, and the rivers were simply the first to feel its touch. Beneath the rolling hills of central France lies a network no map dares to show. Old lava tubes twist through the rock like forgotten hallways, some blocked for centuries, others still open to anything willing to travel through them. Historians are still debating whether these channels once carried molten rock directly toward the river valleys, or if they formed later, carved by water seeking the easiest way out. Either way, they are perfect roads for whatever stirs deep underground. In the case of the Auvergne volcano, those channels might have been nothing more than harmless scars, until the winter warmth began melting ice deep inside its flanks. That meltwater, heavy with ash, minerals, and clay, found its way into the tunnels. Once inside, it didn't just sit there, it moved, slow but determined, like a shadow stretching toward the light. By the time spring arrived, it had connected with the very arteries that feed the Loire and Seine. Geologists today would see the signs instantly: warmer water in certain riverbeds, a change in mineral content, gas bubbles rising from specific points. But in the 19th century, no one had the tools or the urgency to look that closely. A river was a river, and if it ran high in spring, you thanked the melt and cursed the flood, never wondering if it had a second, hidden source. Some believe the channel feeding the mud was a collapsed cave, widened over centuries by trickling water. Others think it was a direct remnant of the volcano's last eruption, a lava flow that cooled into a perfect underground pipe, waiting for something to fill it again. What they agree on is that once the mud entered, it could move without resistance, bypassing obstacles on the surface and emerging far from where it began. Stories from rural farmers hinted at something strange long before the first fish died. Wells in certain hamlets ran cloudy for weeks, then cleared without explanation. Springs that had been dry for decades suddenly gushed warm water, steaming in the winter air. A few even claimed they'd heard a faint rumble underfoot, like distant thunder, on days when the river seemed most restless. In Paris, such stories were too small, too scattered to matter. The city saw the Loire and Seine as open books, their waters flowing from mountains and rain. The idea that an unseen hand, or in this case, an unseen tunnel, could be writing its own story beneath the surface was too far-fetched to believe. But the mud didn't need belief. It needed only the slow pull of gravity, the patient erosion of its path. In the dark, it slid forward, unseen and unstoppable, traveling through rock that had been waiting for centuries to be used again. Every drop, every grain, carried the volcano's memory. By the time anyone would realize there was a connection between a sleeping mountain and the streets of Paris, the channel would be full, the journey almost complete. The city would not hear the footsteps of what was coming, only the knock on its door. It happens just before dawn, when the city is still half asleep and the streets are wrapped in mist. You're lying in bed when you feel it, the faintest vibration, like a heavy cart rolling somewhere far away. It's too soft to be alarming, too brief to be certain. You wait for it to pass, and it does. But as you drift back towards sleep, you realize something. No cart makes the glass on your nightstand tremble. At breakfast, the neighbors mention it in passing. Someone says it might have been the early train, though the station is miles away. Another claims it was thunder, though the sky is clear. No one lingers on the subject for long. In a city that's lived through revolutions, riots, and fires, a little shaking barely counts as news. But still, as you walk to work, you catch yourself glancing at the cobblestones, as if expecting them to move. The rumble returns that night. You're reading by lamplight when it rolls under your feet. Soft, steady, then gone. In the silence that follows, you hear the faint clink of the lamp's glass settling back into place. The sound feels like a whisper you weren't supposed to hear. Historians are still debating whether these were genuine pre-shocks from underground movement or simply the city reacting to pressure changes in the soil. But to you, it feels personal, like the ground just exhaled under your chair. In some quarters, the tremor rattles windows enough to wake people. A grocer on the Rue Saint-Denis swears his jars of olives clink together on their shelf. A baker claims the dough in his proving drawer slid a full inch to the left. These little stories circulate at the market, drawing chuckles. Paris is stretching her legs, someone jokes, but the humor rings thin when the ground moves again the next day. By the end of the week, it's no longer rare. The rumbles come at odd hours, during morning prayers, in the middle of lunch, deep into the night. Always soft, never violent, like a polite knock on the door before the visitor lets themselves in. And though no buildings fall, the rhythm of the city shifts slightly, as if everyone is holding their breath without realizing it. You walk past the Seine one evening and see the water quiver against the stone edge. Tiny concentric ripples spreading out where no boat has passed. It looks like the river itself is listening. For a moment, you stand still, caught between the beauty of the scene and the unease it stirs. Somewhere upstream, in the hills you've never seen, the giant is breathing deeper. In the salons, the subject surfaces now and then, usually in the form of a story meant to entertain. A noblewoman claims her chandelier swayed during dinner. A painter swears the tremor smudged the line of a portrait he was finishing. The room laughs, glasses clink, and the talk moves on. But underneath, there's the quiet acknowledgement that Paris is feeling something new, and no one knows what it means. The rumbles do not announce themselves with urgency. They arrive gently, like a memory returning in fragments. But each one lasts a second longer than the last. And if you put your palm flat on the floor, you can almost feel the direction it comes from. Not the heart of Paris, but far beyond, in the hills where warmth rises through the snow. The first crack appears in a bakery on Rue du Temple. It runs from the top corner of the wall down toward the display case, thin as a pencil line. The baker notices it while sweeping before sunrise. He frowns, traces it with a fingertip, and decides it must have been there all along. But when he opens the shop the next day, the line is longer. A cobbler 2 streets over sees the same thing, a hairline fracture zigzagging behind his workbench. He blames the damp, muttering about how winter's chill gets into everything. Still, he can't remember it being there last week. He tries to ignore it, but as he hammers nails into a sole, he swears the wall gives a faint sigh. By the weekend, shopkeepers across the city are noticing similar changes. Cracks in the plaster, tiles shifted just enough to catch the toe of a boot, door frames that seem to lean where they didn't before. They trade complaints over coffee in the morning, each one wondering if the others are exaggerating. Historians are still debating whether these were early signs of soil subsidence caused by the underground mud flows. Some of the cracks are subtle, thin lines easily hidden with a coat of paint. Others spread quickly, forming spider webs across ceilings. In one milliner's shop, a hat stand wobbles every time a cart rolls past outside, though the road hasn't changed. She starts keeping her most delicate pieces in boxes, fearing they might tip over. It's the market hall that draws the most attention. A long split runs down one supporting column, just wide enough to fit a coin into. Merchants argue over whether it's dangerous, while customers step carefully around it. The city sends a mason to inspect the damage, who shrugs and says it's just settling. "Old buildings do this," he insists, but the market's oldest vendors shake their heads. Old buildings settle once, not over and over. One night, a tailor working late hears a faint crackling sound above him. He looks up just in time to see a small flake of plaster drift down from the ceiling, landing on his cutting table. The sound is so gentle it could be mistaken for rain, but outside the sky is clear. He sweeps it away but leaves the shop earlier than usual. The next morning, Paris wakes to find the number of cracks doubled. It's as though the city spent the night stretching and flexing in its sleep. On certain streets, the cobblestones feel softer underfoot, a quiet give that makes people walk faster without realizing why. By now, some shopkeepers are joking that the city has caught a cold, but others have stopped laughing. They keep their ledgers close, their cash boxes closer, and their eyes on the walls, wondering what will give way next: the plaster, the cobbles, or the ground itself. The scientist's name is Auguste Lenoir, a quiet man with the posture of someone who's spent most of his life bent over a desk. He isn't famous, not yet, but he has a habit of noticing things other people overlook. When the first reports of wall cracks reached his ears, he didn't think of shoddy plaster or settling buildings. He thought of pressure. Pressure moves through soil the way heat moves through a kettle, quietly at first, then all at once. Lenoir had been mapping ground movement for years, mostly for academic curiosity. He kept a small basement office near the Jardin des Plantes, filled with dusty instruments and ledgers stacked like unstable towers. The morning after the latest tremor, he pulled out his old diagrams of Paris's subsoil, tracing the layers of clay, sand, and limestone beneath the city. As he did, a troubling thought took shape. The ground's balance had shifted, and the cracks above were only the skin-deep symptoms. He left the office that day with a notebook under his arm and spent hours walking the streets, pausing to kneel and press his palm to the cobbles. Sometimes he felt nothing. Other times a faint vibration ran up his arm, as if the city's heartbeat had grown irregular. Historians are still debating whether his measurements were accurate or if his mind was primed to find patterns. What's certain is that he filled 3 notebooks in a single week. One night, unable to sleep, Lenoir took a carriage to the riverbank. The Seine was high, its surface flickering under the gaslights. He dropped a weighted line into the water and timed how long it took to sink. The results made his brow furrow. The riverbed had built up in certain spots, as though something heavier than silt was settling there. He wrote in his notes, "The river is feeding on something from beneath." Back in his office, he set up small glass tubes filled with river water from different locations. Over the days that followed, he watched fine particles drift to the bottom, forming a layer the color of wet ash. The samples from upstream were clear by morning. The ones from certain bends stayed cloudy for days. He circled those spots on his map, drawing faint lines that stretched south toward the Auvergne. Lenoir tried to share his findings with a colleague at the Académie des Sciences. The man listened politely, glanced at the maps, and said it was an interesting theory before changing the subject to opera tickets. It was the 19th century equivalent of a polite brush-off, but Lenoir didn't stop. He simply worked in silence, convinced that the city's foundation was being fed from a source no one wanted to acknowledge. He began spending his evenings in the quieter quarters, talking to shopkeepers, market sellers, even children playing in the alleys. He collected their stories of strange creaks in the floorboards, soft spots in the pavement, and water that smelled faintly of burnt matches. Every account went into his notebook, each one a puzzle piece. By the time the first real signs of mud appeared in the outskirts, Lenoir had already drawn the path it would take. He kept the map in his desk drawer, folding it carefully each night. He didn't know if he would be believed, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever was moving toward Paris, it had already chosen its road. The meeting room of the Académie des Sciences smelled faintly of pipe smoke and old paper. Lenoir sat at the far end of the long mahogany table, his maps and notebooks neatly arranged before him. Across from him, a half-circle of senior scientists regarded him with polite detachment. He spoke about the tremors, the cracks, the sulfur in the river water. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed urgency. When he finished, there was a pause, then a ripple of indulgent smiles. The chairman cleared his throat. "Seasonal movement," he said, as though the words settled the matter. He explained that soil expands and contracts with changes in temperature and moisture, especially after early springs. Cracks in buildings, shifts in cobblestones, even slight changes in river current, all normal. The other members nodded in agreement, their pens scratching quick notes that would be filed and forgotten. Lenoir tried again, pointing to his map of the ancient volcanic channels, tracing their path toward the city. "The source is not weather," he insisted. "It is geological, and it is moving." But to the assembled men, geology belonged to the mountains, not the heart of Paris. Historians are still debating whether this was stubborn ignorance or the product of a worldview that refused to connect rural France with the capital's safety. One member, a well-dressed hydrologist, asked whether Lenoir had considered the impact of recent construction on the city's foundations. "Perhaps the railway expansion has unsettled the soil," he suggested. Another offered that the tremors might be due to distant mining activity. They tossed possibilities around like a parlor game, each one skirting the reality Lenoir was trying to put before them. When the discussion ended, the chairman closed his ledger with a decisive thump. "We thank you for your diligence, monsieur, but Paris is not in danger." The verdict was clear. The city's institutions had no room for such an inconvenient theory. Lenoir's findings would remain his alone. Outside, the afternoon light spilled across the Seine, catching in the ripples. Lenoir stood on the Pont Neuf for a long time, watching the water glide beneath him. He imagined what was moving in that water, far below, and wondered how long it would take before someone else could see it. He suspected they wouldn't look until it was too late. In the days that followed, Lenoir received no further invitations from the Académie. His letters went unanswered. He continued his walks through the quieter quarters, listening for the tremor underfoot, marking new cracks with chalk when he found them. The city above him bustled as always, blind to the current beneath. Paris, he thought, had mistaken stillness for safety, and soon the ground would remind it that stillness was only the surface. The first sag appears on a quiet side street near the Marais. In the pale morning light, it looks like nothing more than a shallow dip in the cobblestones, the kind that forms when carts roll over the same spot for decades. But the shopkeeper across the street swears it wasn't there the night before. By noon, 2 more dips appear nearby, as though the ground is exhaling in soft, uneven breaths. In Montmartre, a row of houses sits just slightly askew. The difference is small, enough that a marble placed on the floor rolls gently toward the door. Residents joke about living in crooked cottages, but the humor fades when they notice the door frame sticking or the cellar steps feeling steeper. Historians are still debating whether these shifts happen gradually or if the underground mud caused sudden, silent collapses in the soil. Along the Seine, pedestrians find themselves walking uphill toward the river, a disorienting sensation that makes them stumble. At one quay, a bench tilts so far forward that no one dares sit on it. Street vendors simply drag their carts to more level ground and carry on selling chestnuts, pretending the old cobbles are simply being Parisian. In the markets, deliveries arrive late because wagon wheels sink slightly into newly softened patches of road. Drivers curse under their breath as they heave the wheels free, their boots coming away caked in an unfamiliar, grayish mud. It isn't the gritty brown soil they know. It's finer, almost silky, and it clings stubbornly. In one neighborhood, children take to rolling marbles down the sagging streets, laughing as they race toward the lowest point. Their laughter echoes between buildings that now lean toward each other by a fraction of an inch. Adults watch, unease hidden behind forced smiles, as if pretending the game is harmless will make the street straighten again. At night, in the soft glow of gas lamps, the dips in the road cast strange shadows. From certain angles, it looks as though the cobblestones are draped over something moving beneath them, like a blanket pulled over restless legs. Those who walk home late quicken their steps, unable to shake the image. Lenoir, ever watchful, marks each sag on his growing map. The pattern is unmistakable now, a slow, creeping line heading toward the center of the city. Each new dip in the street is a breadcrumb leading from the hills of Auvergne to Paris's very heart. And still, the city continues to bustle above the softening ground. Its people too busy to notice that the streets they trust are quietly learning to sink. It begins with a single carriage on the Pont Marie. The driver snaps his reins, but the horse stops dead halfway across. Its ears flick back, hooves shifting uneasily on the stones. The driver curses, tugging harder, but the animal refuses to move forward. Then just as suddenly it bolts backward, nearly tipping the carriage into the railing. People laugh at the scene, thinking it's just a stubborn horse. Over the next week it happens again, not just on the Pont Marie, but on the Pont Neuf, the Pont au Change, even the smaller footbridges. Horses pause, sniffing the air, ears twitching as if listening to something no human can hear. Some sidestep toward the railing, others plant their hooves and refuse to budge. Drivers mutter about ill-tempered beasts, but the pattern is clear to anyone paying attention. Animals sense what people ignore. The faint hum of the bridge underfoot, the vibration that runs up their legs, the subtle shifting of stones as the structure settles. Historians are still debating whether these tremors came from the mud pushing against hidden supports or from pressure building in the riverbed below. Whatever the cause, the horses know. On market days, the problem becomes a spectacle. Crowds gather to watch drivers coax, cajole, and curse their way across. Some use blindfolds, others try leading the horses by hand. A few carriages turn back altogether, taking the long way around. Merchants grumble about lost time, but the animals are stubborn, and their fear is contagious. One coachman swears his horse trembled all the way across the Pont Saint-Michel, sweat darkening its coat despite the cool morning air. Another says his team refused to set a single hoof on the Pont Royal until the bells of Notre Dame finished ringing, as though the sound itself masked whatever they were hearing beneath the bridge. By now, the stories have spread through the stables. Even riders on horseback notice it. The way their mounts slow on certain streets leading to the river, ears flicking toward the water, muscles tense. A few have taken to dismounting and walking their horses across, hoping to avoid an outright refusal. Lenoir hears the rumors and adds them to his notebook. To him, the bridges are more than crossings. They're sensors, each one revealing where the vibrations are strongest. And the pattern they draw is as clear as the sags in the cobblestones. The city's undercurrent is no longer hidden. Still, most Parisians chalk it up to animal stubbornness. After all, bridges have stood for centuries. What could possibly shake them now? They don't realize the answer is already sliding beneath the river, inching closer with every silent breath. It happens just after sunrise at the small church of Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre. The square is empty, the air still, when the bell in the tower gives a single, deep toll. A few pigeons startle into flight. There's no one in the belfry. The ropes hang slack, swaying only slightly. The sound drifts over the river, lingering longer than it should in the quiet. The priest, arriving moments later, finds no sign of intruders. The wooden beams look steady, the iron bell secure. He chalks it up to wind, though the air is calm enough to make candle flames stand perfectly straight. Still, he writes it in the parish log, not as a miracle, but as an oddity. The next morning it happens again, one toll. This time a baker on his way to work hears it and pauses in the street. He looks up to see no movement at all in the tower, only the echo of the bell fading against the stone. Historians are still debating whether underground vibrations could have traveled up the tower's frame to shake the bell free. Soon whispers spread among parishioners. Some call it a warning from heaven, others a reminder to pray. A few joke that the church is waking earlier than they are. But as the days pass, the bell rings more often. Always alone, never in a sequence, and always at odd hours. One dawn, Lenoir arrives to see for himself. He leans against the church wall, notebook in hand, when the sound comes, low, resonant, and heavy. He feels it in his ribs more than his ears. Looking up, he sees the rope stir ever so slightly, not from above, but from a subtle shift in the ground beneath the tower. In nearby buildings, glassware rattles faintly in cupboards at the same moment the bell sounds. Residents notice but dismiss it, assuming a cart rolled by, yet no cart is in sight. On certain mornings, even the pigeons don't wait for the bell to move. They take off seconds before, as though expecting it. The priest prays a little longer each day now, though he doesn't say why. The bell rope remains untouched, but the marks on the floor show it has been pulled, however briefly, from somewhere deep in the earth's patience. And so the city gains another sign, another whisper in its growing chorus of unease. But like the horses in the sagging streets, it's filed away in the mind as something curious, not something dangerous. The bell keeps ringing, and the ground keeps breathing. Theories always come later, when the danger has already shown its face. In the years since, historians have filled shelves with papers debating whether the strange events of that spring were caused by groundwater displacement. They describe it clinically: water saturating the soil, loosening its grip, letting the ground sink in soft, uneven waves. In Paris, though, it hadn't felt clinical. It had felt like the city itself was sighing under its own weight. Groundwater is invisible until it changes something you can see: a crack in a wall, a door that won't close, a bell that rings on its own. In the Auvergne, melting ice from the volcano's slopes had been feeding into underground channels for months, perhaps years. When it reached the softer soils beneath Paris, the water didn't stop. It moved through clay like a hand through fabric, pulling everything with it. Some scholars argue this was a natural cycle, a rare but harmless quirk of the seasons. Others point to Lenoir's notebooks, where he traced the movement south to north, matching each sag in the street to a warm spring or sulfur-scented pool upstream. The debate continues, but the truth is simpler. Whatever the cause, it was coming straight for the city. At the time, though, no one called it groundwater displacement. Shopkeepers just saw more dust falling from their ceilings. Drivers noticed certain streets felt softer under the wheels. Priests heard their bells ring without human hands. The words didn't matter, the pattern did. In the neighborhoods closest to the river, the changes were more obvious. Cellars that had been dry for decades now dripped steadily. Wooden beams swelled and warped. Barrels rolled slowly toward one corner of a storage room and stayed there, as if magnetized by something unseen. Lenoir knew water could explain some of it, but not all. Water alone didn't hum under your feet or carry the faint smell of burnt matches through stone walls. Whatever was happening wasn't just wet ground. It was movement. Thick, deliberate movement, the kind that needed more than rain to begin. Still, water was the comfortable answer, the one the city could live with. No one wanted to hear about volcanoes breathing or mud traveling through ancient tunnels. Paris preferred its dangers to be local and familiar, like a flood or a fire. Those could be seen, fought, and rebuilt from. And so the official record, for now, called it seasonal, cyclical, harmless. But beneath that safe label, the true cause kept sliding forward, one patient inch at a time, until the day it would finally arrive. It comes in quietly, like a guest who forgot to knock. At first, it's just a wet sheen on the far edge of a dirt road, puddles merging where no rain has fallen. But by midday, a slow, gray ribbon has formed, twisting its way between fence posts and hedges. It moves like a lazy river that hasn't decided on a destination, except you can hear it breathing. A faint, sucking sound as it pulls against the ground. The color's wrong for rainwater. This isn't brown, muddy runoff from a spring storm. It's pale gray, like wet cement, flecked with tiny black grains that glint in the sun. The air smells faintly of burnt matches in clay ovens, the kind you might find in a summer pottery class. Kids in the outskirts poke at it with sticks until their mothers call them in, voices sharp with a note they can't quite explain. A farmer loading sacks of grain onto his wagon watches the flow creep across his yard. He swears it's moving uphill toward his barn. Slow, deliberate, like it has somewhere specific to be. Historians are still debating whether this behavior was caused by pure pressure from upstream or by underground channels guiding it along. The farmer doesn't care about the science. He just grabs his chickens and gets them to higher ground. Dogs refuse to go near it. One shepherd's collie circles the gray water twice, growls low in its throat, then trots back toward the house without a glance over its shoulder. Cats, as always, seem indifferent. One sits right on the edge, tail flicking, until the flow licks at its paws. Then it vanishes up the nearest wall, leaving deep claw marks in the plaster. By evening, the sound changes. The flow no longer whispers, it murmurs. You can hear it from 50 feet away, a soft churning like clothes in an old washing machine 2 floors below you. People notice without meaning to. They pause mid-sentence, tilt their heads, then shake it off. Pretending you didn't hear is easier than asking what it is. In one cafe on the outskirts, patrons gather at the windows to watch. Someone jokes that Paris is getting a new canal, only uglier. The laugh is quick and nervous, dying in the space between sips of wine. Out here, away from the city center, people don't need a scientist to tell them when the ground is sending something their way. Lenoir arrives at dusk, taking careful steps toward the gray ribbon. He kneels, scoops a handful into a glass jar, and watches it ooze to the bottom. "It's warm," he murmurs, almost to himself. He doesn't write that in his notebook. He just knows that warmth means movement, and movement means the volcano's breath has finally reached Paris's doorstep. That night, the flow slips farther into the outskirts, curling along alleys and garden walls. It doesn't rush, it doesn't need to. A thing that has been moving for centuries knows the value of patience. By morning, the gray flow has reached the edge of a schoolyard. The children spot it first. A slow, shimmering ribbon curling around the stone wall like a parade float that lost its way. To them, it's not threatening. It's interesting. They shout to each other, daring friends to get close, tossing pebbles to see if they'll bounce. The pebbles vanish into the surface with a soft gulp, like the mud just swallowed a secret. One boy runs home and returns with a stick topped by a paper flag, jabbing it into the center like he's claiming new territory. The flag tilts, then slowly spins as the stick sinks halfway down. The crowd of children erupts in laughter. Someone says it looks like the world's slowest magic trick. No one notices the faint warmth in the air or the sulfur smell that lingers on their sleeves afterward. A teacher tries to herd them back inside, but even she finds herself staring for a moment too long. It's mesmerizing the way the surface folds in on itself, like thick pancake batter poured onto a griddle. Historians are still debating whether the flow's odd movement patterns were purely a result of pressure or if the underground channels created eddies that rose to the surface. Parents hear the laughter from blocks away and come to see what the fuss is about. Some chuckle, some shake their heads. One man mutters that it looks like something he saw in the Auvergne as a boy, only smaller. Another says it reminds him of the slow tar pits he'd read about in American newspapers. The comparison gets a few uneasy nods. The children, unbothered by adult unease, start a game of mud tag where you win by getting as close as possible without letting it touch you. The boldest boy earns bragging rights when the tip of his boot grazes the surface, though the gray stain it leaves will never come out. His mother later scrubs it so hard the leather cracks. Someone in the crowd jokes about charging admission. "Step right up, see the magical moving street." The laugh ripples through the adults, but it's the nervous kind, the one that comes when you don't quite believe the joke is safe. Even the children seem to sense it's time to back away, retreating to the curb as the flow inches forward. By afternoon, the carnival attraction has swallowed half the schoolyard wall, the stones slipping away into the pale churn. The flag planted earlier is gone, its paper dissolving somewhere under the surface. The laughter has faded. The children are back inside, their games quieter now. That night, the flow slides past the school, heading toward the busier streets. It leaves behind a smooth, wet trail that reflects the street lamps like spilled mercury. The next morning, the trail will be gone, not because it dried, but because the ground itself will have pulled it under. It begins with a small, uneven tilt that no one notices until a picture frame falls from the parlor wall. The homeowner picks it up, puzzled, then feels the faint slope under his feet as he crosses the room. In the basement, the air smells damp. Not the usual musty stone, but something heavier, like wet clay. Overnight, the gray flow that crept through the street has reached the house's foundation, and the earth beneath is no longer solid. By morning, the front step has sunk just enough to catch the postman's boot. He curses under his breath, shaking off the gray film clinging to the leather. Inside, the family debates whether it's safe to stay. The oldest son swears he heard the ground gurgle when he opened the cellar door. Historians are still debating whether this melting effect was caused by direct contact with the volcanic mud or by groundwater liquefying the soil. Neighbors gather outside, watching the slow disaster unfold. The base of the house looks like it's dissolving into a chocolate-colored slurry, the walls sagging as if someone has pressed down on the roof. The children from yesterday's mud tag game stand silent now, holding hands, their eyes fixed on the way the house seems to exhale brown bubbles from underneath. Furniture is dragged into the street, chairs, a dresser, a sewing machine, each piece leaving muddy footprints on the cobblestones. The piano takes 4 men to move, its legs sinking into the street before they have carried it more than a dozen yards. A neighbor jokes that they should play it while they still can, but no one laughs. As the day wears on, the brown slurry swallows more of the foundation. The kitchen door no longer opens. The frame has twisted. From the street, the windows look crooked, their glass reflecting the crowd in warped shapes. The roof, still intact, now sits at an odd angle, like a hat tipped too far on someone's head. Lenoir arrives just as the first wall gives way with a soft, wet sigh. He kneels, scooping the slurry into a jar, noting its warmth and strange consistency. To him, it's confirmation that the mud's advance is no longer confined to low ground. It can lift and undermine whatever stands in its path. He marks another red line on his map, closer now to the heart of Paris. By nightfall, the house is no more than a tilted shell. The family has moved in with relatives across town, their possessions stacked in borrowed rooms. The street where their home stood feels different now, the ground spongy underfoot, as though it's still chewing on what it took. And the flow moves on, slipping past the ruin it made, looking for the next patch of ground willing to let go. The morning after the first house gave way, the story made the front page of Le Petit Journal. The headline read, Le glissement. Une mystérieuse coulée menace les rues. The article described the collapse in calm, almost clinical terms, but the nickname stuck. Le glissement sounded harmless enough, like a clumsy tumble rather than a force that could swallow a neighborhood. By noon, other papers picked it up. Some treated it like a curiosity, printing sketches of the sinking house with exaggerated angles, as if it were part of a carnival sideshow. One illustrated it with a smiling moon looking down on a sliding row of rooftops, a touch of humor to soften the unease. On Café Terrace, people traded rumors about the slide. Some swore it had started with a burst water main. Others claimed it was the work of saboteurs tunneling under the streets. A few, remembering tales from the countryside, muttered about the volcano in Auvergne, but their voices stayed low. Historians are still debating how much the press's light tone delayed the city's awareness of the real danger. Vendors in the markets capitalized on the story, selling postcards of Le glissement for a few centimes. The images showed children pointing at cracks, women carrying baskets past leaning walls, and carriages detouring around sunken streets. It became a sort of urban spectacle, something to visit on an afternoon walk, much like the ruins left behind after a fire. In the city offices, the name took on a bureaucratic weight. Reports were filed under Le glissement, as if branding it gave the phenomenon boundaries. But each new document described a different street, a new sagging row of stones, another building showing signs of strain. The slide was no longer a single place. It was becoming a map. Lenoir clipped each article and pasted it into his notebook, marking the locations in red ink. The pattern was tightening around the river, and the speed of new reports told him what the public didn't yet realize. Le glissement was not moving aimlessly. It was heading toward the city's heart. At night, when the streets emptied, the slide kept working. The ground shifted in silence, cobblestones settling lower by fractions of an inch, unnoticed until morning. The name made it sound gentle, almost graceful, but there was nothing graceful about the slow ruin it left behind. And as Paris slept, the gray flow kept slipping forward, unconcerned with headlines or laughter. Names didn't matter to it, only the path ahead did, and that path was narrowing toward the very center of the city. It happens on a bright morning in the Marché des Enfants Rouges. The stalls are already busy, the air thick with the smell of fresh bread, roasting chestnuts, and ripe cheese. Then at the far end, a shout goes up. Not from alarm, but from confusion. The ground under the butcher's stall seems to be bending. Slowly, the front legs of the wooden table sink, tipping sausages into the dirt. At first, people laugh. The butcher curses and tries to wedge a crate under the table. But the crate sinks too, disappearing into a gray pool that wasn't there an hour ago. Within minutes, the sinkhole is as wide as the stall itself, and the butcher is hauling his goods onto higher ground. The movement is so slow it feels like watching bread dough rise. Only here, the dough is the earth. Across the square, the bakery feels it next. The front step lowers by an inch, then another, until the door jams. Inside, trays of croissants slide toward the wall, and a stack of baguettes topples like dominoes. The baker and his wife work in frantic silence, carrying what they can to the back alley. Historians are still debating whether the market sat directly over an old volcanic channel or whether the mud found its way here through smaller cracks in the soil. Crowds gather, drawn by the strange sight. Some stand with their hands on their hips, watching as the cobblestones buckle like a quilt being tugged from underneath. Others pull their children closer, suddenly aware of how quiet the birds have become overhead. Vendors scramble to save what they can. The flower seller abandons her cart when the wheels refuse to turn, the rims buried in the softening street. The fishmonger loses a full crate of eels when the counter slides just far enough for the lid to pop open. The eels writhe on the ground, then vanish into the gray ooze. Lenoir arrives breathless, with his notebook under his arm. He doesn't try to save anything. Instead, he kneels near the edge of the spreading pit, watching the mud fold and breathe like a living thing. He knows this is no isolated event. It's the first bite of a meal that will not end here. By late afternoon, the stalls are gone. Only a warped rectangle in the cobbles remains, damp and glistening under the sun. The bakery door is still jammed shut, its lower half buried in a film of sticky clay. The smell of bread hangs in the air, mixed now with something acrid and metallic. And as the crowd drifts away, the gray sheen creeps another few inches toward the next street, as if already choosing its next course. By nightfall, the mud has moved past the market and into the narrow streets beyond. In some alleys, it's no deeper than a puddle, just enough to stain the hem of a skirt. In others, it rises to the knees, thick enough to pull at boots and swallow drop parcels. The air smells of wet stone and sulfur, the scent clinging to everything it touches. In one tenement, the residents are already in motion. Two men carry a wardrobe between them, struggling to keep it above the surface. A woman wades behind them, clutching a bundle of blankets to her chest. Children are sent ahead with small items: shoes, pots, a battered kettle, their legs coated in gray up to the thighs. The sludge moves deceptively slow, yet the effort to cross it feels like walking through poured cement. Every step is a fight, every lift of the foot followed by a sucking sound. Historians are still debating whether the consistency came from volcanic ash mixing with groundwater or from the erosion of clay-heavy soil beneath Paris. Whatever the cause, it makes every escape twice as exhausting. In some streets, neighbors form human chains, passing furniture hand to hand toward drier ground. A man with a piano refuses to leave it behind, insisting it has been in his family for 3 generations. It takes 8 people to move it, the instrument tilting dangerously with every step. When they finally reach a safe corner, the keys are spattered with mud, but the man still sits to play a single note. The lamps along the street throw fractured reflections across the sludge, making it look like rippling metal. In that strange light, people's faces are pale and drawn, their clothes plastered to their bodies. They speak in short bursts, saving their breath for the work of carrying, dragging, and waiting. From a nearby balcony, an old woman watches it all unfold. She leans on the railing, her shawl wrapped tightly around her, and mutters that she's seen this before. Not here, but in the south, when the earth moved without warning. No one hears her over the grunts and splashes below. Lenoir passes through the chaos, pausing to help lift a chest of drawers before moving on. He notes the direction of the flow, the way it seems to choose certain streets and ignore others. The path is narrowing, like a funnel leading toward the city center. By dawn, the residents have moved what they can. The rest is left behind, half buried, the tops of chairs and tables jutting from the mud like the bones of some strange gray beast. On the Rue des Francs-Bourgeois, the mud has climbed so high that the lower floors of certain buildings have vanished entirely. From a distance, it looks as if the rooftops are floating, anchored only by the chimneys that still poke into the air. Most people see ruin. One man sees a canvas. Henri Vallin, a painter known for his street scenes, stands on the second-floor balcony of a friend's flat, easel set against the railing. His brush moves quickly, capturing the way the afternoon sun glints off the wet gray surface, how the reflections ripple with each subtle shift of the flow. From his vantage point, the scene is almost too strange to be real. Brick walls disappearing seamlessly into the muck, shutters half submerged, laundry lines dangling above an alien sea. Historians are still debating whether Vallin's later painting of this day exaggerated the colors or faithfully recorded the eerie light. What's certain is that people who see it years later swear they can smell the damp air. Below him, the rooftops seem adrift. The tops of dormer windows peek out like small boats on a foggy lake. A stray cat balances on one ridge, tail lashing, before leaping onto a windowsill just above the rising sludge. Neighbors lean out of upper windows to watch Henri work. Some ask why he would waste his time painting disaster. He answers without looking up, because it's already gone. The only way to keep it is here. His voice carries across the street, mingling with the creak of beams under strain. The mud doesn't rush. It rolls, curling against the walls like a tide that refuses to break. In the distance, a church bell tolls. One note, low and heavy, just as it did weeks ago when this all began. Henri pauses to dip his brush again, adding the bell tower's reflection to the surface below. As evening falls, the colors in the street change. The sun turns the mud a deep silver, and the rooftops glow faintly in the dying light. Henri keeps painting until he can no longer see the lines, the last strokes guided more by memory than by sight. By morning, the rooftops he painted will be gone, swallowed completely, but the canvas will remain, a quiet witness to the day Paris looked like it was floating on a molten sea. Centuries earlier, the volcano in the Auvergne had roared to life for what everyone thought was the last time. The eruption blackened the sky, poured rivers of molten rock down its slopes, and carved the network of tunnels that now lay beneath the French countryside. When it fell silent, people celebrated the death of the mountain. But mountains don't die, they wait. Historians are still debating whether that final eruption set in motion the events now unfolding in Paris. Some argue that the lava left behind was riddled with weak points, hollow pockets, and thin ceilings that slowly crumbled over the centuries. Others believe the channels remained stable until recent decades, when melting ice and shifting groundwater began to pry them open again. Old journals from the region mention warm springs that appeared suddenly in the years after the eruption, and streams that turned cloudy without rainfall. One account describes livestock refusing to graze near certain patches of land, as if the grass hid something breathing beneath it. At the time, these were curiosities folded into local lore. Geologists today see them differently. Each warm spring was a vent, each cloudy stream a clue, each frightened animal a witness to changes no one could measure then. The tunnels may have been dormant, but they were never empty. Over time, water, minerals, and pressure worked together like locksmiths on a stubborn door. In Paris, no one thought about a centuries-old eruption when rooftops floated above the gray tide. The idea seemed absurd. A rural legend, too far in the past and too far away to matter here. But the mud beneath their feet carried the volcano's signature in its temperature, its smell, and the fine ash suspended in every drop. Lenoir, studying his samples by lamplight, saw the connection clearly. The ash in his jars matched records from the volcano's final outburst. The flow under Paris was not born of local floods or broken sewers. It was the breath of that same mountain, arriving late but intact. This knowledge gave him no comfort. If the eruption had sent its legacy this far after so many years, it meant the mountain still had reach and patience. The tunnels weren't just channels, they were invitations, and the mud had accepted. As the rooftops vanished one by one, the past and present felt less like separate chapters and more like a single, unbroken story. One the city had been walking into for centuries without ever looking down. The order comes at dusk, just as the street lamps are being lit. Word spreads quickly. The mud is coming faster tonight. Within an hour, an entire district is on the move. Lanterns swing in hundreds of hands, their flickering light turning the narrow streets into a river of gold above the river of gray creeping below. The air smells of damp earth and burnt matches, a scent that clings to coats long after you've left. From above, it looks like a festival. Lines of glowing lights winding through the alleys, children in their parents' arms, shopkeepers pushing carts piled high with goods. But the sound is wrong. There's no music, only the shuffle of feet and the occasional shouted name. Historians are still debating whether this rapid movement was sparked by panic or by a rare, sudden surge in the mud's advance. Either way, Paris hadn't moved this quickly since free wine was given out at the Bastille's anniversary. Some carry furniture. Others, oddly, carry nothing but pets. Cats in baskets, dogs on ropes, one man with a parrot under his coat. A little humor cuts through the tension when the parrot starts yelling, "Allez! Allez!" as if commanding the crowd. For a brief moment, even the soldiers directing the evacuation crack a smile. The glow of the lanterns turns every face into a flickering portrait. Eyes wide, cheeks pale, mouths set in thin lines. Every few streets, the crowd stops to let carts squeeze through, their wheels crunching on loose cobbles. In the distance, the mud glints under the same light, sliding forward like something that knows exactly where everyone is going. Lenoir walks near the front, scanning each intersection for signs of seepage. He marks the walls with chalk as they pass, a quick X for streets already threatened. He knows these marks will be meaningless in a day, maybe less, but it's the only map the evacuees have in the moment. From the balconies above, those refusing to leave watch the procession like spectators at a strange parade. Some wave, others just lean on the rail, as if sheer willpower can keep the mud away. One old man even raises a glass, toasting the glowing crowd below. At the edge of the safe zone, the lantern light pools in an open square, where soldiers herd people toward temporary shelters. The crowd moves slower now, the fatigue of carrying heavy loads showing in bent backs and shaking arms. The glow here is brighter, but so is the smell, that faint sulfur tang that says the mud is closer than anyone wants to believe. As the last group crosses into safety, the lanterns bob away into the distance. Behind them, the streets fall into darkness, and in that darkness, the gray flow slides forward without a sound. Before the first human footsteps echo in the evacuation streets, the animals are already moving. Dogs that normally roam the alleys on lazy patrols are suddenly sprinting uphill, tongues lolling, ears pinned back. Cats vanish from doorsteps where they've lounged for years, slipping into shadows and reappearing blocks away. It's as if some invisible whistle has called them all at once. In the courtyards, owners find empty bowls and claw marks on doors where their pets scratch to be let out in the night. A grocer swears his shop cat leapt onto the counter, stared toward the river, and bolted out the window without looking back. Historians are still debating whether the animals were reacting to vibrations, the smell of sulfur, or something we can't yet measure. But their timing is uncanny. The higher gardens of Paris, the terraced parks, the grounds of old convents, the private orchards behind wrought iron gates, fill quickly. Dogs pace the gravel paths in tight circles, whining under their breath. Cats claim the rooftops and stone walls, watching the lower streets like sentries on a medieval tower. If anyone notices, they say the animals are just restless. One carriage driver, stuck in the mud line earlier that day, tells a story in a cafe. A stray mutt he'd tossed scraps to for years ran alongside his carriage for 3 blocks before darting up a narrow staircase to a hidden courtyard. "Looked back at me like I was the stupid one," he says, and the table erupts in uneasy laughter. From the higher ground, the animals keep their distance from humans. They don't mingle in friendly packs. They watch. Their eyes catch the lantern light at night, rows of glowing dots in the hedges and on the walls. The sight is unnerving, like a silent audience waiting to see how the city will end its performance. Children notice first. They try to coax the cats down with bits of bread or call the dogs with whistles. Nothing works. Even the most loyal pets hesitate, ears flicking toward the distant rumble that no one else seems to hear. The kids give up eventually, trailing back to their families with puzzled expressions. Lenoir notices too. Passing through a terraced garden, he sees the animals frozen in place, all facing the same direction. south toward the volcano's hidden heart. He stops long enough to write it down. They know the path better than we do, he murmurs, closing his notebook. And then the night deepens. The gardens go quiet, and the city below glistens under the creeping gray. The animals don't move from their posts. Whatever is coming, they intend to see it arrive. It begins subtly, as so many things have in the past weeks. One evening, you're walking through a narrow lane, and you realize something feels off. It takes a moment to notice what it is. The city is too quiet. No clink of glasses from the cafes, no footsteps on the cobblestones, no muffled arguments drifting from upstairs windows. Just the soft, wet gurgle coming from somewhere below. At first you think it's the sound of a drain, maybe a broken water pipe, but it doesn't stop. It pulses in slow, irregular beats, like the last bubbles rising from a boiling pot. Sometimes it's louder, sometimes fainter, but it's always there if you pause to listen. Historians are still debating whether this sound was caused by gas escaping from underground channels or by the mud itself squeezing through narrow spaces. The effect on the city is immediate. Conversations falter when the sound grows louder, replaced by nervous glances toward the ground. Street musicians stop mid-song, their eyes searching for the source. Even the drunks in the alley go quiet, straining to hear it. The gurgle has a way of pulling at your attention, as if it's speaking in a language you almost understand. In some places, the sound echoes strangely off the walls, magnifying until it feels like it's coming from inside your own chest. A shopkeeper in the Latin Quarter swears he could feel the rhythm in his teeth. Like standing too close to a church organ, he says, except there's no music, just the low, constant churn. By the river, it's louder still. The Seine's gentle slap against the stone embankments is now accompanied by a sucking noise beneath it, as though the river is trying to drink itself. Lantern light glitters on the water's surface, but beneath, shadows shift in time with the gurgle. It's hypnotic, and more than one passerby lingers too long, staring into the ripples. Lenoir takes measurements where the sound is strongest, leaning down with a small brass tube to his ear. The notes he scribbles are terse, volume increasing, intervals shortening, source deeper than expected. He closes his notebook quickly, as though writing more might make the sound grow stronger. That night, as people lie in their beds, the gurgle drifts through the floorboards. It weaves into dreams, pulling strange images to the surface. Sinking streets, whispering walls, rivers that run uphill. In the morning, no one speaks of the dreams, but everyone steps more carefully on their way to work. And so, in the place where Parisian chatter once filled the air, there is only the breathing of the earth, steady, patient, and entirely in control. The first cafe to try it is a small place on Rue Vieille du Temple. The owner props the door wide open, letting the scent of coffee mingle with the faint sulfur in the night air. Inside, the musicians tune their instruments, a violin, an accordion, and an upright bass with a cracked neck. No one says it aloud, but they all know the mud is only a few streets away. When the first notes of the waltz begin, the cafe fills with people who have nowhere else to be. Couples sway in the narrow aisles, careful not to bump the tables piled with half-finished drinks. Outside, more gather in the street, leaning in to catch the melody. Historians are still debating whether this last waltz tradition started spontaneously or if it was planned as a final act of defiance against the slow advance of the mud. The rhythm is gentle but insistent, a 3-beat heartbeat against the background gurgle from the ground. The accordion sighs in long breaths. The violin spins a line that rises and falls like a street lamp flickering in fog. Someone hums along, someone else laughs softly, the sound breaking like glass before it can spread. Across the city, other cafes follow suit. In Montmartre, a guitarist plays on a terrace overlooking the sinking streets, his fingers moving faster than the mud creeping below. Near the river, a clarinet carries a melody so sweet it feels almost cruel, like telling a bedtime story while the room fills with smoke. Lenoir pauses outside one of these cafes, notebook in his pocket, eyes closed as he listens. For a moment, the sound almost erases the smell of sulfur and the distant churn. Almost. Then he opens his eyes and sees the glow of lanterns reflecting in a gray sheen at the end of the street. Inside, the musicians keep playing. A young woman in a blue dress spins once, her hem catching on the leg of a chair, her partner laughing as he frees it. Their shoes leave faint prints in the damp floorboards. No one minds. When the song ends, there's no applause. Just the soft scrape of chairs and the creak of the door as people step into the night. The mud will reach this place by morning, but tonight it belongs to the music. And somewhere in the dark, past the cafe lights, the flow listens too. On the edge of the marais, an old church that hasn't heard a sermon in years finds itself full again. Its heavy wooden doors hang open, and the candlelight inside flickers against walls damp with age. Word has spread that the mud hasn't touched this block yet, and a few dozen Parisians have decided that here, at least, they will make their stand. The pews are mismatched, some solid oak, others patched with scrap wood, but every seat is taken. Families sit with their belongings piled at their feet, as if waiting for a train that will never arrive. In the aisles, neighbors exchange quiet greetings, their voices softened by the cavernous space. Historians are still debating whether this gathering was born of faith, stubbornness, or simple exhaustion from constant evacuation. At the front, the altar is bare except for a single brass candlestick and a chipped ceramic bowl filled with water. A child dips her fingers in, then laughs when her mother pulls her hand away. The sound echoes in the rafters, bouncing off the cracked frescoes of saints whose faces have faded into shadow. Through the stained glass, the lantern light from the street filters in as fractured patterns of gold and red. It makes the mud outside, visible in the far distance, look almost beautiful, a shimmering river framed by holy scenes. Someone mutters that perhaps the saints are watching, though no one dares to finish the thought. An old man with a voice like gravel stands near the door, acting as a sentry. He keeps glancing down the street, his hand resting on the edge of the door, as though ready to close it at a moment's notice. But the truth is, the doors wouldn't hold back the mud for more than a few seconds. In one pew, a woman unwraps a bundle of bread, passing slices to anyone who will take them. The crust is hard, the inside still soft. The act feels almost ceremonial, though it's born of practicality. No one knows how long they'll be here. Lenoir arrives quietly, slipping into the last row. He doesn't take notes this time. Instead, he sits back, watching how still everyone has become, as though by holding their breath, they can keep the world outside frozen in place. And in the silence between each creak of the building's timbers, the faint gurgle can still be heard, growing just a little louder with every passing minute. The bridge at Rue du Pont-aux-Choux is narrow, cobbled, and older than most of the buildings around it. Tonight, it's the only way out of the quarter, without wading through knee-deep mud. Lanterns line its railings, their reflections rippling in the black water below. But as the night deepens, the bridge itself begins to change. It starts with a low groan, so faint it could be mistaken for a passing cart. Then the stones underfoot shift, just enough for the lantern flames to shiver. People crossing stop mid-step, glancing down as though the river has moved closer. Historians are still debating whether the sag came from the riverbank, eroding beneath the bridge, or from underground mud pushing upward against its supports. A wagon loaded with furniture makes it halfway before the horses refuse to go on. Their hooves clatter nervously, breath steaming in the cold air. The driver curses, tugs at the reins, but the animals won't move. Behind him, a line of evacuees forms, clutching bundles, crates, and sleeping children. From the far bank, soldiers shout for everyone to hurry. Their voices carry over the water, sharp against the quiet of the quarter. But each step onto the bridge feels like walking on an old mattress, the kind where the springs have given out and the middle sags dangerously low. A sudden crack splits the night. One of the stone balusters tilts, then slides into the river with a hollow splash. The crowd gasps, shuffling back as if the whole structure might give way at once. The driver unhitches the horses and leads them off, abandoning the wagon to its fate. Lenoir pushes forward through the throng, scanning the supports with a small lantern. The light catches on something strange, a thin line of gray slime seeping between the stones, as though the mud has found its way into the bridge itself. On the far bank, the soldiers make the call. No more crossings, the last handful of people hurry across, the bridge sagging visibly under their weight. When the final step lands on solid ground, the quarter is cut off. And in the water below, something stirs. A swirl that doesn't belong to the current, curling toward the base of the bridge, as if claiming it. By morning, the talk in the cafes and bread lines isn't about the bridge anymore. It's about the cellars, Word drifts in from every direction, floors giving way beneath shopkeepers, wine racks vanishing into holes that weren't there yesterday, basements swallowing themselves with a sound like tearing cloth. The rumors move faster than the mud, leaping from district to district. At first, no one believes them. Paris has always had strange noises underfoot. Carts rumbling on the stones, water rushing through old drains. But then a baker's apprentice in Saint-Antoine swears she saw her boss disappear mid-step, the dough still clinging to his hands. Historians are still debating whether such collapses were truly sudden or if unnoticed cracks had been spreading for weeks. The wine merchants are the most shaken. In certain streets, entire seasons of vintages vanish overnight. Bottles are found later, unbroken but caked in mud, stacked neatly in cavities where no one can reach. A shop owner tries to lower himself down with a rope, but the walls crumble under his weight, forcing him to scramble out as the floor dissolves beneath him. Children are told not to play in the streets where the paving stones sound hollow when tapped. Mothers test each step before walking, feeling for the faint give of earth that's no longer solid. In the market, a man drops a crate of apples when the stall beside him suddenly tilts, its legs sinking as if into water. Lenoir inspects one of the collapsed sites, lowering a lantern into the jagged opening. The light disappears into a darkness that swallows color, revealing only damp stone walls slick with the same ash-gray mud. He ties the lantern to a string and lowers it farther, counting the seconds until it touches bottom. He stops at 40 and still hasn't reached it. Some whisper that the volcano's tunnels are finally reclaiming the space they lost centuries ago, using the cellars as convenient entrances. Others say the city is hollowing itself out, like a fruit gone soft at the center. At night, the gurgling is louder near these collapsed sites, the sound bouncing off invisible walls beneath the streets. People sleep lightly, waking at the faintest creak from the floorboards, unsure if they'll be standing on the same ground by morning. And somewhere in the dark below, the mud keeps moving, patient as ever, choosing its next doorway into the city above. The idea comes late at night in a room that smells of damp paper and candle smoke. City engineers, military officers, and a handful of old masons gather around a map of Paris laid across a table. The plan is simple in theory. Open the sealed sections of the ancient aqueducts and let the mud follow the easiest path out of the city. Simple, but not without risk. The aqueducts haven't carried water in decades. Some sections are blocked, others unstable, their stones loosened by roots and time. Historians are still debating whether their structure could have handled the surge or whether the plan was doomed before it began. The men in the room choose not to dwell on that part. Teams are assembled before dawn. They carry lanterns, pickaxes, and barrels of powder for blasting through collapsed passages. The work starts in the outer districts, where the aqueduct mouths still gape in overgrown courtyards or behind shuttered warehouses. One crew finds a section so choked with debris, it feels like tunneling through a wall of old tombstones. Lenoir joins the team at the Rue des Martyrs, where the aqueduct runs beneath a row of abandoned stables. The air inside is cool at first, then damp, then warm, unsettlingly warm. The walls sweat in the lantern light, streaked with mineral stains that shimmer faintly. Somewhere deeper in the dark, there's the familiar sound of gurgling. The first breach is made in the early afternoon. A section of wall crumbles under a hammer's blow, and a thin stream of gray pushes through. The men step back, waiting for it to widen. When it does so slowly, almost politely, curling into the channel as if inspecting the path ahead. By evening, several channels are open, guiding the flow toward the old route that once carried spring water into the city. On the surface, people watch as the mud in certain streets thins and the gurgle fades. Hope stirs, fragile as the paper maps in the engineer's hands. But not all channels behave. In some, the mud refuses to enter, pooling instead at the mouth before retreating underground to find another way. The masons mutter about choosy water, the soldiers about trickster ground. And under the streets, in the veins of stone meant to save the city, the gray tide moves according to its own design, not the one drawn in chalk above. At first, the engineers believe it's working. The opened aqueduct channels seem to drink in the slurry, pulling it away from the worst-hit streets. Maps are updated with quick, hopeful pencil strokes, but by dawn, the mood changes. A messenger bursts into the planning room, boots caked in wet clay, shouting that the flow has reappeared. Not at the outskirts, but in the center. The room goes silent. No one can quite process it until he describes the location. Place des Vosges. It's impossible. The square is higher than much of the surrounding city. Historians are still debating whether a hidden collapse in the aqueduct wall redirected the flow or whether the mud was never truly under control in the first place. Lenoir is already moving before the arguments start. He grabs the nearest lantern and heads toward the square, weaving through streets that smell of scorched oil and damp stone. The air grows warmer with every turn, a kind of oven heat that clings to the lungs. Somewhere ahead, there's the faint, familiar churn, but faster now, like a pot set to boil over. When he reaches the square, the scene is surreal. The ornamental fountains are gone, swallowed by a roiling, molten gray pool that spits small bursts of steam. The slurry is no longer creeping. It's surging, curling over itself in slow, heavy waves. Garden benches float lazily in circles, like driftwood on a sluggish tide. Soldiers rush to set up barricades, dragging carts and barrels into position. Children are lifted onto shoulders, their small hands covering their ears as the sound grows louder. One cart tips, spilling sacks of flour that vanish under the gray within seconds, leaving only a cloud of white powder drifting above the surface. Lenoir pushes through to the edge, dropping to one knee. The ground here is trembling in short, uneven jolts, not the steady pulse of before. It feels like something underneath is shifting, breaking apart. He shouts to the officers that the aqueduct's breach must be sealed now, before the pressure builds further. But the reply comes too late. A section of cobblestone at the far end of the square buckles, then folds inward like soft paper. The slurry leaps to meet it, a single powerful surge that slaps against the barricades and sprays the onlookers with warm droplets. People scream, stumble back, but the flow doesn't chase them. Not yet. And in the rising steam, Lenoir catches a glimpse of something impossible. A thin ribbon of red earth swirling in the gray, as if the volcano itself has finally found a way to sign its name in the streets of Paris. The first sign is the sound. It's no longer the slow gurgle that lulled people into thinking they had time. It's a rushing, sloshing roar that bounces off the walls and seems to come from every direction at once. People freeze, unsure which way to run. Then, as if on cue, the mud breaks through a side street and slides into view, moving at twice its usual pace. Shouts erupt. The neat lines at the barricades dissolve instantly. Families grab whatever they can carry, not their heaviest belongings, just whatever is already in hand, and sprint toward the nearest uphill road. Historians are still debating whether this sudden acceleration was caused by a partial collapse of the aqueduct system or by the mud finding a new underground channel. A fruit cart tips over in the chaos, sending apples rolling across the cobblestones. A boy slips on one, is yanked up by a stranger, and disappears into the tide of fleeing bodies. The smell of sulfur is sharper now, tinged with something metallic, like hot iron. Lenoir tries to direct people toward the safer routes, but the flow is unpredictable. It forks around buildings, then merges again, cutting off escape paths that were open seconds before. The lantern light bouncing off the moving surface makes it look alive, like a snake shedding skin as it moves. Near the old post office, a group of soldiers forms a living wall, holding people back from a street that's already half consumed. Their boots sink into the softening stones, but they hold until the last possible moment, then break formation and run. Someone yells that the higher district gates are closing. Panic flares. People push harder, the air filled with the sound of gas and ragged coughing. A woman loses a shoe and doesn't even look back. From a balcony above, an old man drops a rope ladder into the crowd. A handful grab on, climbing into his apartment before the mud reaches the doorway below. His face disappears into the shadows without a word. And through it all, the rushing sound grows louder, as though the city itself is a shell pressed to your ear, letting you hear the sea, except this tide isn't going out. The hill at Montmartre becomes the city's final island. From here, you can see the streets below twisting with gray, the rooftops jutting out like stranded ships in a slow-moving sea. People pour in from every side, spilling onto church steps, gardens, and narrow stairways that groan under the weight. At first, there's relief. Survivors hug, share water, even laugh nervously at how close they came. But as more arrive, the space shrinks. Elbows brush, tempers fray, and the quiet tension of the crowd turns sharp. Historians are still debating whether more lives were lost to panic here than to the mud itself. Families mark out tiny territories with blankets, crates, or overturned chairs, guarding them like fortresses. Arguments flare over a patch of shade or a dry spot on the steps. A man tries to push through with a sack over his shoulder, only to be shoved back by three others. The sack bursts, spilling silverware across the cobblestones. Lenoir moves among them, scanning faces for signs of injury or exhaustion. He stops to help a boy who's wandered too close to the edge. The drop below now a sheer wall of flowing gray. The boy's eyes are wide, not from fear, from fascination. "It looks like it's breathing," he whispers. Supplies are thin. The bread brought from the lower districts is gone in hours. A bucket of water is passed hand to hand until it's just a damp ring at the bottom. People glance toward the basilica, its white dome bright against the dark clouds, as though expecting some kind of guidance from within. Rumors ripple through the crowd. The gates to the hill will close soon. Soldiers may stop letting people in. Each whisper spreads faster than the last, making the air heavy with suspicion. Neighbors who shared food an hour ago now avoid each other's eyes. At the edge of the hill, musicians who survived the cafes tune their instruments again, hoping to calm the mood. But their notes are swallowed by the distant roar of the advancing tide, a reminder that the high ground is only temporary. And somewhere deep in the crowd, a voice shouts a single word: "Cracks!" And the sea of bodies sways toward the sound, straining to see where the hill's first fracture might appear. The warning comes not from the ground, but from the air. A deep, hollow boom rolls across the hill, rattling the stained glass of the basilica and sending pigeons spiraling into the dark sky. People freeze, their eyes scanning the horizon for the source. Then they see it, a column of steam rising from the very heart of the city, curling into the clouds like a slow-motion explosion. The mud surges in response, not in the steady crawl everyone has learned to fear, but in a single, unstoppable wave. It swallows entire blocks in minutes, climbing stairs, spilling into windows, dragging the last floating benches and barrels with it. Historians are still debating whether this final push came from a collapse deep within the volcano's ancient tunnels or from the aqueducts finally giving way. On Montmartre, the crowd instinctively moves back from the edge, pulling children close, pressing their backs against walls. The sound is deafening, a mixture of rushing water, shifting stone, and the sharp crack of collapsing buildings. Lenoir stands apart, near the overlook, watching the line where gray meets sky. In the chaos, his notebook is gone, his lantern extinguished, but he doesn't move. This is the ending he's been chasing, the moment when the city becomes something unrecognizable. The surge reaches the base of the hill, curling around it like a moat. Streets vanish under the churning surface. Rooftops become islands, and the smell of hot earth rises until it coats the tongue. Somewhere below, the bells of a church ring wildly before falling silent. Then, as quickly as it began, the movement slows. The surface flattens, steam drifts upward, and the city's sounds are replaced by a thick, unnatural quiet. The mud has stopped, but it has remade everything it touched. People on the hill stare at the transformed landscape. No roads, no fountains, just a glistening plain where Paris once pulsed with life. Someone mutters that it looks like the moon. No one disagrees. And in that stillness, you realize there's no going back, only forward into a city that now belongs to the earth beneath it. And now the city sleeps, not in the way it once did, with the hum of footsteps and the clink of cafe cups, but under a blanket of cooled earth, smooth and quiet as if nothing had ever moved here at all. From up here, the streets you knew are just shadows in the stone. The lamps are gone, the fountain's gone. Even the echoes have sunk beneath the weight of it all. Only the moon watches, tracing pale silver across a landscape that used to breathe. Somewhere under that still surface are stories that will never be told, names that will never be spoken again, except here with us. And maybe, years from now, someone will walk these frozen waves of earth and wonder what it felt like to watch a city drown in silence. So, before you drift off, tell me, if you had been here, would you have stayed to see the last moment or run before it ever came? Leave your answer in the comments and rate tonight's disaster from 1 to 10. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next night we walk through the ruins of forgotten history together. Good night. May your dreams be quiet, your roads be dry, and your steps be steady. See you in the dust of history.